Hello and welcome. In this edition, we will understand GST on renting of building. Friends, first let us classify buildings. Basically, buildings can be classified as residential, residential, and commercial. And commercial. The residential can be further classified into used for residence, used for residence, and used for commercial purpose. For commercial purpose. Now we will understand the GST implication for all these three. One is residential used for residence. The second one is residential used for commercial purpose. And the third one is building used for commercial purpose. Okay, or a commercial building for that matter. Now, sometimes the rent may be exempted. Sometimes the rent is chargeable on forward charge basis. Sometimes the rent is chargeable on reverse charge basis. For rent, all the three are possible. Means sometimes the rent gets exempted, sometimes the rent is chargeable on forward basis, and sometimes the rent is chargeable on reverse charge basis. Forward charge basis means the landlord will be pay the GST to the government. Reverse charge means the tenant will pay the GST to the government. We will understand each and every aspect separately in the time to come. Now, what is the rate of tax? Generally, for rent, the rate of GST is 18%. The rate of tax is same both for the forward charge as well as the reverse charge. The rate of tax will be 18 percentage, be it on forward charge or be it on reverse charge. Now, sometimes the rent will be exempt. When it will be exempt? There are two entries for this purpose. Okay, we are not dealing with land and other things. We are dealing with only building for now. Now, there is entry number 12 and entry number 12A. Now, entry number 12 basically refers to SAC SAC 9972. Okay, SAC 9972. Now, what is this SAC 9972? Renting or leasing services involving own or leased residential property and renting or leasing services involving own or leased non-residential properties. Of course, there are other entries also, but in this session, we are dealing only with these two entries, right? Now, what is the exemption available in entry number 12? Service by way of renting of residential dwelling. First point means a residential property is rented out. Now, that tenant should use that building for the purpose of residence. That is condition number 2. Except where the residential dwelling is rented to a registered person. So there are three conditions which are required to be satisfied in order to get this exemption. Now let's understand what do you mean by residential dwelling. The term residential dwelling is not defined in the GST law. Generally, in common parlance, it is understood that a residential dwelling means it includes all residential accommodation. But however, it will not include hotel, motel, inn, guest house, campsite, lodge, houseboat, or similar type of places. Actually, these are not covered under 9972 classification. These are covered under 9963 classification. Okay, we will deal at a later point of our discussion, right? So, Basically, in order to get a exemption on rent received, as per entry number 12 of the exemption notification for services, the three conditions that are to be complied with is condition number one, it should be a residential dwelling. Residential dwelling. And what is the second condition? The second condition is it should be used for residence. Used for residence. And what is the third condition? The tenant. The tenant should not be registered person. Means the tenant should be unregistered person. The tenant should be unregistered person. These three conditions are to be satisfied. Now, there is a problem here. Let us say Mr. A has let out his apartment, residential apartment, to Mr. X. Mr. X is proprietor of X and Co. Mr. X is proprietor of X and Co. And he is a registered person in the GST. Now, if he has taken a residential apartment for his own residence, then whether exemption is available or not is a question. On the plain reading of entry number 12 of the exemption notification, three conditions are to be satisfied. Now, in respect of Mr. X, condition 1, condition 2 are satisfied. But coming to condition number 3, he should be an unregistered person. Then only he will get exemption. But what has happened is here he is a registered person. So he may not get exemption. But wait a minute. There is an explanation to this entry number 12. What does that explanation say? For the purpose of exemption under this entry shall cover service by way of renting of residential dwelling to a registered person. Means this exemption is available to a registered person also in some cases. What is that case? The tenant is a proprietor and his proprietary concern is a registered person, and the residential dwelling is taken in his personal capacity for use of his own residence, and such renting is on his own account and not that of the proprietary concern. Now, if this condition is satisfied, then the rent is exempted. Okay, so here the registered person, renting should not be done to a registered person, but it has an exception. What is that exception? A proprietor of a proprietary concern has taken on rent a residential property for his own residence on his own account, and the proprietary concern has nothing to do with this accommodation. In such a case, though the proprietor is a registered person, but still the exemption under entry number 12 is available. Now, let us say a company has taken this residential apartment on rent. Then this, and the company is a registered person. Then this exemption in entry number 12 is not applicable. GST is leviable, but that is not on forward charge. That will be on reverse charge. How come reverse charge? You have an entry number 5AA in the reverse charge notification. That we will deal at a later point of our discussion. Right? Next. Next comes a question where what is the chargeability of the accommodation for students in student residences, accommodation provided by hostels, camps, paying guest accommodation, etc. Actually, they are not covered in SCSC 9972. Entry number 12 is applicable to only SCSC 9972. These people these hostels, paying guest accommodation, etc., they will come in classification SAC 9963 classification, they will come. They have exemption in another entry, that is entry number 12A of the exemption notification, which we will deal in a later part of our discussion. Now come back to this 9972 and exemption number 12, entry number 12. There we said that if the residential dwelling used for residence is given to a registered person other than a proprietor in his personal capacity, exemption is not available. GST is required to be paid, but the GST is not on forward charge. The GST is on reverse charge. Why? Because of entry number 5AA of the reverse charge notification number 13 of 2017 central tax rate. Okay. What does this entry number 5AA states? Service by way of renting of residential dwelling to a registered person. Who is the landlord? Landlord is any person. He can be a registered person or he can be a unregistered person. Any person can be the landlord. But who is the tenant? Tenant is a registered person. The tenant is registered person. In such a case, the GST is to be paid on reverse charge. Who has to pay the reverse charge? The tenant, that is the registered person in this case. This is with regard to the residential dwelling. Okay. Next, we will examine commercial property. Generally, if someone let out a commercial property to another person, forward charge is leviable. Means the landlord has to pay GST to the government. Of course, he can collect it from the tenant. But for renting of commercial property also, in one situation, GST is leviable on reverse charge by virtue of entry number 5B of the reverse charge notification, that is notification number 13 of 2017 central tax rate. Now, what is that situation wherein for commercial property rent, GST is liable to be paid on reverse charge? What is that situation? That situation is, now what is the category of supply of service? Renting of an immovable property other than residential dwelling means commercial property. Means commercial property. Now, who is the landlord? Landlord is the unregistered person or supplier of service is unregistered person. Now, who is the tenant or recipient of service? The tenant is a registered person. Tenant is a registered person. Here, for registered person, you may have two categories of registered persons. One is regular dealer, another one is composition dealer. Now, here, this reverse charge is not applicable to a composition dealer. It is applicable only to a regular dealer. Means the recipient who is a regular dealer, for him alone, this reverse charge will be applicable. Okay. So, till now, what we have done is we have classified the buildings. Point number one. We understood SAC 9972, and also we learned a bit about SAC 9963. What is exemption as per entry number 12 of the exemption notification? And what is reverse charge as per 5AA entry of reverse charge notification and 5AB entry of reverse charge notification? Now let us summarize everything. Now, let us say the building is a residential property and it is used for residential purpose. Now, here, what is the situation? Suppose the landlord is a unregistered person and the tenant is also a unregistered person. What will happen? Will there be any GST? Yes or no? There will not be no GST. No GST. Both are unregistered persons. It is okay. Next comes landlord is a registered person and a tenant is a unregistered person. What will happen in this situation? Here you will get exemption. You will get exemption by virtue of entry number 12. Entry number 12 of exemption notification, you will get an exemption. Next, come to the next situation, that is landlord is unregistered person and tenant is a registered person. What will happen? Here RCM will come into play because now this is by virtue of entry number 5AA of the reverse charge notification. But here, the registered person means we told that we have discussed that if he happens to be a proprietor, he has taken the rent on his own account. Payment of rent is also in his own account. For them, reverse charge is not applicable. Exemption is applicable. Next comes landlord is a registered person and a tenant is also a registered person. What will happen? In this case also, the RCM will come into play and this is by virtue of entry number 5AA of the reverse charge notification. Now, this is the scenario for residential property used for residential purpose. Now we'll move on to the next situation wherein the property is residential property and it is used for commercial purpose. Okay. Now let us analyze each and everything. The landlord is unregistered person and also the tenant is a unregistered person. What will happen? There will not be any GST. No GST. No problem at all. Both are unregistered fellows, so there will not be any GST. Next comes when the landlord is a registered person and the tenant is a unregistered person. What will happen? Landlord is a registered person, tenant is a unregistered person. Here, the property is used for commercial purpose. Entry number 12 is applicable only for residential dwelling used for residential purpose. So here forward charge will be applicable and the rate of GST will be 18 percentage. Now next comes the question of unregistered person is a landlord and a tenant is the registered person. What will happen? This is a residential dwelling and this is let out to a registered person by a unregistered person. Now here what will happen is RCM will come into play by virtue of 5AA. By virtue of 5AA because this is a residential dwelling given to a registered person. So exemption is not available and RCM under 5AA will come. Next is registered person to registered person. Tenant is a registered person. Okay. Therefore, RCM will come into play and by virtue of entry number 5AA of the reverse charge notification. All right. Now let us come to renting of commercial property. If you come into renting of commercial property, here we have something called as landlord unregistered person and tenant is also a unregistered person, what will happen? No GST. No GST because both are unregistered persons. Next comes landlord is registered person and tenant is unregistered person. What will happen? Forward charge will come and the rate of GST is 18 percentage. Here also, whenever RCM comes, rate of GST will be 18%. Here also, whenever RCM comes, rate of GST will be 18%. Okay, now we'll move on. The landlord is unregistered person and the tenant is registered person. What will happen? This is a commercial property and unregistered person is the landlord, means the person who is giving it on rent. But the recipient is a registered person. Then what will happen is reverse charge will come by virtue of entry number 5AB and the rate of GST will be 18 percentage. And next comes registered person. Now here the registered person is a regular dealer. The registered person is a regular dealer here. Now, what will happen if a landlord is unregistered person and tenant is a registered person, but who is a composite dealer? Who is a composite dealer? Then no GST. GST will not come because entry number 5AB specifically states that registered person is the tenant or recipient other than a composite dealer. Okay. And next comes registered person to registered person. Then we have forward charge GST at the rate of 18 percentage. Okay. Now we'll move forward to entry number 12A of the exemption notification. Now, this entry number 12A deals with SAC code 9963. SAC code 9963. Now, what is this 9963? It includes room or unit accommodation service for students in student residences, room or unit accommodation services provided by hostels, camps, paying guests, and the like. Other room or unit accommodation services not elsewhere classified. Okay. So for hostels, paying guest accommodation, and students' hostels in universities, colleges, etc., this SAC 99963 will come into play. Okay. Now, do these people have any exemption? Yes, there is an exemption by virtue of entry number 12A of the exemption notification. That is, supply of accommodation services, supply of accommodation services to whom? To whom means supply of accommodation services to any person. Okay, to a person having value of supply less than rupees 20,000. The value of supply is less than 20,000 rupees per month per person. Per month per person. The value of accommodation should be less than 20,000. Less than or equal to 20,000. And the accommodation should be provided for a minimum of 90 days. So, what are the conditions here? Basically, two conditions are there. The value of the accommodation should be less than or equal to 20,000 per person per month, and the accommodation should be taken by them for a minimum period of 90 days. Then you will get an exemption for that rent. Okay. Now, What are all the persons who will get this exemption? This 9963 code people will get the exemption if these two basic conditions are satisfied. Now, let us look into a bit. Suppose there is Mr. A who is running a hostel, who is running a hostel or what you get paying guest accommodation for him, whether he is liable to pay. Now, this will be on forward charge basis only for him, whether he has to pay GST on rents collected from the people who have taken that hostel accommodation or paying guest accommodation. Here, if per person per month the rent is less than or equal to 20,000 and they have taken they have taken the accommodation for at least 90 days minimum, then they will get exemption as per 12A of the exemption notification. Okay. Now, if this hostel or paying guest accommodation supplies only this exempted service, then they need not pay GST and they even need not take the registration also. Because a person who is supplying only exempted services need not take registration also. Okay. Next, what will happen if Mr. X has a residential apartment? He gave it to Mr. A, who is running a hostel. Who is running a hostel. Now, Mr. X will come under SAC code 9972. Residential dwelling used for residence. And if Mr. A is unregistered person, this fellow will get exemption by entry number 12 of the exemption notification. Now, if this person happens to be a registered person, what will happen? Then RCM will come into play. RCM will come into play. That will be 5AA of the RCM entry. I entry number 5AA of the RCM notification. Okay. Now, for this person who is running the hostel, for him, the SAC code will be 9963. 9963. And he may examine if he can get exemption by virtue of 12A of the exemption notification. Okay. Now, sometimes what will happen is, suppose, 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 let us say this person uh, who is running the hostel may also, along with accommodation, supply internet, food, etc. In such a case, the total money received for all these supplies, this will become a composite supply. This will become a composite supply. Along with accommodation, he is providing food and internet also. This will become a composite supply. Then, for all this, if he is charging less than or equal to 20,000 per month per person and the accommodation is for minimum of what you say that 90 days, then exemption by entry 12A will be available. Else, it will be chargeable to GST on forward charge basis at the rate of 18%. Okay. Now, what will be the case of a service apartment? What will be the case of a service apartment? Actually, you need to examine whether this service apartment comes under classification 9972 or classification 9963. If it comes as a 9972, then if other conditions are satisfied, you may examine whether you get a exemption by virtue of entry 12 of the exemption notification. Now, if this comes in the classification of 9963, then you can examine whether an exemption is available by virtue of entry number 12A of the exemption notification. Generally, the service apartments are classifiable as 9963. Okay. Now, let us say one Mr. P has two apartments, and these two apartments he gave it to Mr. X. He gave it to Mr. X on lease or rental basis. Okay. Here, it is a residential dwelling and it will be used for residence only. Then he can examine if he can get exemption under entry number 12. But when it comes to Mr. X, he will definitely go into 9963 classification. If he go into 9963 classification, he has to examine only if he get a exemption under entry number 12A of the exemption notification. Else, he will be chargeable that rent received by him by running that service apartment will be chargeable to the GST under forward charge at the rate of 18%. So, friends, I thought we have examined the rent received on buildings. Hope you have understood. Understood. Thanks for watching and see you next time.